Hey there, young historians and future leaders of America, and I definitely mean that. We need you to be the future leaders of America. It absolutely pains me to say that we're only going to have 2 days to spend on the civil rights movement. This is a movement that demands more time than just 2 days, but hey, that's all the time we have in these crazy times, so I'm going to do my best to get as much information as I can packed in, and I would also like to offer up some other places you could find more information about the civil rights movement, so we'll get to that a little bit later. So I want to remind you that the civil rights movement is all about this goal of ending segregation and securing equal rights for all Americans, no matter what their race or color is. Now, you might remember that when we talked about different amendments after the Civil War, there was an amendment that said all Americans, regardless of skin color, must be treated equally under the law. The problem was there was a lot of people and governments and state governments and police forces that were not enforcing that law. They were allowing for segregation and discrimination to happen. In one of those places, and these places were mostly across the South, but one of those places was in businesses. And businesses were having segregation still in the 1960s, where they wouldn't allow whites and blacks to be mixed in public places. And those private businesses, especially restaurants or what are they called, lunch counters, were really discriminating against African Americans. So these nonviolent protests now extend into these private businesses or these small businesses. Basically, a lunch counter is sort of a place where you can go and get a lunch, a small meal, burger and fries or a sandwich or something, milkshake. But they're inside of like convenience stores. And so these African Americans and some of their white allies began to protest this discrimination by hosting these non-violent sit-ins, where they would just sit at the counter, ask to be served. When they'd be denied a service, they would just stay sitting there and harming the business financially, which was the goal. But as you can see here, oftentimes these people would sit at the counter and they'd be surrounded by these threatening and menacing groups that didn't like that African Americans were trying to gain these equal rights. And you can see here that no matter what happened to them, no matter what happened to the protesters and the activists as they sat here, they did not get violent. So you can see these menacing figures in the background that are clearly being harmful. They would get, eventually they would get very violent as well. Here's a large sit-in that has been organized. One of the people that was involved in these nonviolent protests is this man in the bottom left here. His name is John Lewis. And John Lewis was part of these protests, fighting for equal rights for African Americans. John Lewis is still alive, and he has now been a congressman, a U.S. representative from Georgia for many terms. As you can see here, him receiving an award from the previous president, Barack Obama. Another example of nonviolent protests was a young lady named Ruby Bridges, and she became the first student to integrate an elementary school. This was in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1960. And Ruby Bridges went to an all-white school, and she, again, was the first black student to go into an all-white elementary school. She had to be escorted by federal marshals all day to protect her. And none of the teachers would actually teach her, except for one teacher. There was one lady who decided she was willing to teach Ruby Bridges, and her name is Barbara Henry. You can see on the right here, Barbara Henry and Ruby Bridges. Barbara Henry would basically teach the class as if it were a full class, while it only was Ruby sitting in the classroom. Ruby Bridges is still alive today, and her and Barbara Henry are friends. On the left there is a painting by Norman Rockwell, a famous American painter. It's called The Problem We All Live With, and you can see Ruby Bridges surrounded by federal marshals. Well, the protest now goes to Birmingham, Alabama, and we're going to see extensive police brutality. As African Americans were just leading nonviolent protests, and police responded with brutality, especially the police chief in Birmingham. His name was Bull Connor. He arrested protesters. He attacked them. He had his police officers beat the protesters using high-pressure fire hoses and dogs to attack the protesters, as you can see here. Again, this is all non-violent protests that was being enacted. There's a video that I'll have you check out after this. Well, during one of these protests, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested for his part in the protests in Birmingham, Alabama, and he went to jail in 1963. While in that jail, he wrote what is known as now one of his famous letters named the Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And he explains the goal of the civil rights movement. And one line from this long letter is, "We who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out into the open, where it can be seen and dealt with." And he sat in that prison cell for a few weeks. Okay. So, as a way to bring attention to this discrimination and these unfair practices, Dr. King and his people organized a march, a peaceful protest march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. And their goal was to march all the way to the Capitol building in Montgomery to protest the unfair treatment and to try to secure a Voting Rights Act to make sure that the voting rights of African Americans were protected. The first time that they crossed this bridge, they were brutally attacked by the police. John Lewis, who I mentioned earlier, the congressman, I'll show you his picture again. John Lewis was actually beaten over the head. His skull was fractured. Many people were injured and arrested as a result of this. Fortunately, the president, his name was Lyndon Johnson, he sent down federal troops to protect the marchers as 3 weeks later they marched again and successfully... Sorry about the dog there. Successfully made it to Selma, Alabama. There's a video on that as well. One last thing. We saw it's called the March on Washington. We saw that picture up there of Dr. King earlier. This is where he gave his speech during the March on Washington. That was the I Have a Dream speech. So Lyndon Johnson, as we can see on the left here, he became president after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, which is a side story, but important in the context here. John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. Lyndon Johnson takes over as president. Now, JFK was actually working on civil rights for African Americans. He believed in it. Lyndon Johnson continued that by signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation and banned discrimination. He also signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed literacy tests and poll taxes and other methods used to deny the vote. So progress was made by 1965. But it took action, nonviolent protest, blood to be spilled, people to be arrested in order to secure those rights. And guess what? The work was not done. Unfortunately, in 1968, Dr. King was also assassinated by a racist man who did not believe in African American equality. And as I mentioned yesterday, the work is still not done today in 2020. There is still equal rights to be gained. There is still equal treatment to be found. And you, future leaders of America, young historians, you are the ones who will lead us there. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I appreciate all of you. Be good to each other. Be kind. Be thoughtful. Goodbye.